The sun was directly overhead, as if watching everything with a cold, merciless interest. It spared no one on this July afternoon. Not the faded shop signs, not the cracked asphalt, not the old men hiding in the shadows of their verandas, not the grey-haired black man slowly moving along the dusty road on an old horse that looked like it was carved from bronze. His name was Eli, and no one in this town knew where he came from. He just was, like he grew out of the ground like a dead tree that had survived more than one fire. They said he used to live somewhere to the south, in the swamps, in a house with no address, that he once had a family, that he held a gun in his hands. But for the last 20 years, Eli never raised his voice, never argued, never begged. He just came into town once a week, always at the same time, always on the same road, and drove back to nowhere. His horse's name was Judith. She was skinny, with a worn saddle and eyes as empty as a well, but there was something about her. Pride, perhaps. When she walked, she seemed to know that the world was bound to part for her. Today was Friday, the day Eli brought in tobacco, a bundle of herbs, and sometimes jam in old jars. He didn't haggle. He just set the goods on the counter and waited for the clerk to count out a few mint bills. That was all. But this morning, the city was different. The heat was pounding in my ears. The air was like frozen concrete. People were quieter than usual, like they sensed something, or knew. At the entrance to the store, right next to the tether block, stood Randall Kane, a white farmer, the heir to land that had been taken from black families. His grandfather had been a shouter at slave auctions, his father an overseer. Randall himself had never worked with his hands. His hands were for whips and guns and tractor steering. His skin was sunburned, his eyes like a hawk's. He stood smoking a joint and watched Eli approach. The silence was so thick you could hear Judith's harness creaking, the saddle creaking, the dry earth crunching under the horse's feet. Eli didn't look around. He rode straight ahead, staring into space. As Judith stopped at the block, her side brushed Randall's wagon. Not much, just a slight sway of an old wooden spoke. "Get that nag away," Randall said without turning around. "She stinks of carrion." Eli slid slowly out of the saddle. He didn't say a word. He just took off his hat, shook the dust off his face, and slowly began to tie the reins. His movements were precise, almost apologetic. He knew where he was, and he knew that any mistake could cost him more than this horse. "Are you deaf, old nitwit?" Randall said louder and came closer. He had a glass bottle in his hand, half empty. Eli straightened up and looked at him. His gaze was calm. No fear, no anger. Just the gaze of a man who remembered too much to be afraid. Randall couldn't take it anymore. He walked up to Judith and, without saying another word, kicked her with all his might right in the stomach with his hoof. The horse groaned and fell to its knees. Its sides heaved, and it tried to rise, but its front legs shook as if they had been cut from soap. Eli stood silently beside it. He did not flinch. He did not rush. Only his lips pressed into a thin black line. "Get your scum out of here," Randall said, walking back to his cart. "And yourself too." The people standing on the bench and at the drugstore opposite looked away. No one intervened. Someone, perhaps, felt sorry for Eli, but not out loud. The sun seemed to grow hotter. Dust hung in the air like smoke. Eli leaned down to his horse, stroked its neck, whispered something no one heard. Then he stood up and walked away. Not fast, not slow, just walked away, leaving the horse lying by the log. Randall watched him go, grinning like a dog who has chased another off his territory. He was already turning away when he heard someone say, "You shouldn't have done that, not to him." But Randall didn't turn around. He didn't believe in stories. He believed in the fist, the gun, and power. Meanwhile, Eli walked down the street. His gait hadn't changed, but anyone who saw his face could feel something cracking inside, something that had been sleeping under his skin for 20 years. He didn't turn toward the old church or the cemetery or the bridge over the river. He went to where no one had lived for a long time, his brother's old house, the house burned by the whites many years ago. but the foundation remained. And something else. There, in the damp basement that smelled of stone, sweat, and iron, Eli took an old box down from a beam. He had been wearing the key on a string under his shirt all this time. Inside was a cloth, wrapped up, and underneath it a heavy, almost black rifle with an inscription scratched with a fingernail, "For those who remain silent." Eli sat down on the cold concrete and began to wipe down his weapon, silently, like someone who had done this hundreds of times. Somewhere on the other side of town, the horse was still lying by the block. Its breathing was becoming less and less frequent. Dust was settling on its sides. No one approached. No one took the reins. Only flies were beginning to gather in the corner of its eye. Evening had not yet come, but the city was already trembling. Because those who saw Eli's gaze when he turned around for the last time knew he was not leaving empty-handed. And no one, not even Randall Kane, understood that this morning would be the last time this city would still call him its own. The town was called Hammerwood, and it was a name that the old men pronounced with a familiar heaviness in their voices, as if each word left dust in their mouths, a small forgotten corner of America where time had not only slowed down, it had stubbornly refused to move beyond the 1960s. It had its own laws, its own churches, its own dead buried along the edge of an old cotton plantation, and its own living who had never decided which was worse, to forget the past or to live alongside it. On the main street stood an old store with a faded sign, Kane and Sons. The sons were long gone. One had drowned in the river, the other had run off with a black girl and never written again. Only the father remained, Randall, 46 years old, his face cut by the sun and cigarettes, the gait of a tired king, and the eyes of a chained dog that no one kept on a chain. He stood by the door, his nose buried in a can of cheap whiskey, lazily blowing smoke through his teeth. There was an old photograph on the wall behind him and his father and grandfather, all three holding guns, all three wearing hats. The caption, "The Pride of Hammerwood, 1922. When Eli came up the road, Randall saw him right away. A tall black figure, slightly bent with age, wearing a worn, dusty coat, riding a horse that the town knew by name. Eli. Fuck. Again. He passed a drugstore where two guys were standing with cans of Coke, and they turned away as if on cue. He passed a bakery where two old white women and a young clerk with a tight bun were looking at him through the glass, trying to look away but unable to, the way Eli looked at you, the way you felt guilty even if you'd never done anything. When he reached the store, Randall didn't move. He simply set the can down on the railing and reached into his pocket. The horse stopped beside him, as always, brushing the fender of his wagon. It didn't break anything, didn't stain anything, it just touched. But that was enough. Randall lurched forward. "You damn old bastard, can't even train your own cattle?" He said it loudly, so that everyone standing nearby could hear. The two young men at the drugstore began to chuckle, the tentative way of people who laugh only because they're afraid they won't. Eli didn't answer. He slid slowly out of the saddle and began tying the reins to the post. His movements were the same as always, quiet, methodical, dignified. That was what pissed Randall off most. This old man, this unsociable black stump, was acting like he had a right to something, like he wasn't a servant, as if he belonged there. Randall came closer. "Did you even hear me, you black scum? I said keep your nag off my property." Eli straightened up, looked at him. Not angry, not afraid, just level. Eyes as dark as soil after rain. "She hit a wheel," Eli said quietly. "I'll fix it." "You can't fix it," Randall said. He took a swig of whiskey, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and walked up to the horse. It jerked. He kicked it. More than once. The first kick caught it in the stomach, and it staggered. The second kick caught it in the ribcage, and it groaned. The horse was all Eli had left of his past, of a world where he had been somebody. And now she was down on the ground, her legs buckling, her neck lolling to one side, the air coming out of her nostrils in short, wheezing gasps. Eli took a step forward, then stopped, still silent. "That's it." Randall chuckled. That's what we do with trash. There was a stir in town. The sheriff appeared on the steps of the drugstore. He didn't intervene. He just lit a cigarette. One of the boys, a teenager, maybe 17, took off his cap. That's too much, he said quietly. Shut up, Randall called over his shoulder. He's lucky I didn't shoot her. Eli leaned over. He put his hand on the horse's neck. She was breathing, but her eyes were full of fear. He didn't try to lift her. He just stayed there. The people started to disperse. The man selling newspapers hid his face behind the counter. The bakery girl slammed the shutters. The town always knew how to keep quiet. Even the air grew heavier, like before a storm. Randall returned to his seat as if nothing had happened. He took a swig from his can and sat down, stretching out his legs. I told you to keep your shit out, he repeated, and laughed. His laugh was hoarse, as if it came from somewhere in his stomach, not his throat. Eli stood up. He took off his hat slowly, like he was at a funeral. He looked toward the store, not at Randall, but a little higher, a little to the left, there, where the plaque with the date of the town's founding hung, where years ago, slave women and their babies had been nailed to death if they tried to escape. He stood there for so long that even those watching from a distance felt uneasy. Then he turned and walked away, without a horse, without a word, without a backward glance, just gone, like a man who had made up his mind. Randall no longer looked at him. He thought he had won. He thought he had made it clear who was boss. He was wrong, because the second his boot hit Judith's body, he had done more than just push the horse. He had awakened something in Eli that had been dormant for years, a quiet, old evil, buried beneath layers of dust and pain and weariness, and the town felt it too, felt the ground beneath their feet as if it were softening, as if it were waiting for blood. The sky remained cloudless that day, but everyone in Hammerwood knew that a storm was already brewing over the town, and this time it would be black. Let's take a short break. Write in the comments where you listen to our stories from. Has there been anything similar in your life? Injustice, silence from others, or moments when dignity cost too much? It would be interesting to hear your stories. Subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. We continue. Judith didn't just fall. She slowly, as if in a silent nightmare, bent in on herself, as if she had surrendered not from pain, but from the fact that someone had torn the last reason to live from her. Her front legs buckled, as if they were not bone but cotton wool. Her back legs trembled and crawled to the sides. Her head fell with a dull thud to the dusty ground at the very edge of the wooden counter, and in that moment it became clear that she would not rise again. Randall took a step back and looked at it all with feigned indifference, as if in front of him was not a living creature, but a pile of rags accidentally caught under his foot. He took another sip of whiskey and threw the empty can at Eli's feet. The can rolled, leaving a dark path in the dust, like a bullet hole. Eli stood nearby, not moving, not breathing. He seemed carved out of stone, not a man, but an obelisk, unconcerned by the wind, the spit, the knife. And there was more menace in that silence than in the scream. But no one understood, or pretended not to understand. Across the street, a boy of about 12, in a patched shirt, stood with an ice cream cone that was slowly melting in his hand. He was staring at Eli with wide eyes. His mother, a blonde with protruding collarbones, yanked him sharply by the shoulder and dragged him back into the store. People were disappearing from the street like insects before a rainstorm. Everyone saw everything, but no one said anything. That was the way it was. That was right. That was safe. The horse groaned, dull, deep, as if from its chest, not its throat. From its lungs, full of dust and fear. Its body began to convulse, and one of its eyes rolled back in its head until only the white was visible. From somewhere inside, maybe a broken rib, there came a faint crunch. No one moved. Only one old man at the sheriff's station stood up as if he wanted to say something, but his lips were pressed together. His name was Mr. Wallace, and he had once been a teacher, long ago, before his class had been divided into coloured and white. He remembered Eli as a boy. He knew who he was. And it was that knowledge that made him sit down again. Randall walked past the horse and said loudly, "Maybe this is a sign for you, Eli. All old things must die. Maybe your time has come." He laughed, showing teeth stained with bourbon. It was not a living laugh. It was the laugh of cattle slaughtered in the slaughterhouse who did not realize that they were already dead. A rotten laugh. An empty laugh. Eli leaned over and touched Judith's neck. His fingers were warm, despite everything that had happened. He whispered, "Quiet, girl, quiet. It's all right." But none of it was all right, because it wasn't just a horse. It was a memory, a symbol, the last thread between him and a life where he was more than just an old black man, but a person, a husband, a father, a brother. The horse had been a gift from his brother, Jonathan, before he was burned to death in his own home, supposedly by accident. But the town knew they were the same people laughing in the streets now, and when Judith fell, it wasn't just Eli that fell with her. It was everything he'd kept hidden beneath his skin for so long, everything he'd carried in silence, everything he'd buried inside himself for years, hoping he could survive simply by not touching anyone. But now it was dead. And the moment Judith closed her eyes with a wheeze, something rose in Eli's chest. Not rage, not a scream. Cold, cold as a blade. The cold of truth. The kind that comes when you no longer expect justice. When you just decide, enough. He stood up. His hands were clean. Not a drop of blood. He didn't walk. He slid across the ground like a shadow. Randall turned. "Where are you going?" he called, still chuckling. "You're not going to leave your beast here to die, are you?" Eli didn't answer. He walked past. Next to him, by the wall of the drugstore, stood a young girl. She looked at him, her fists clenched. Her face trembled. She wanted to scream. She wanted to say, "I'm sorry," or "I'm not like them." But she couldn't, because she knew her voice wouldn't erase this day. Eli disappeared around the corner of the street, and the city came back to itself. People exhaled. Some opened their shops again. Some pretended that nothing had happened. But there was something in the air that couldn't be driven away, a feeling that everyone was complicit, silently, without words, without bullets, simply by not getting between the one who hit and the one who moaned. At sunset, when the street was empty again, the wind picked up a piece of old newspaper and carried it across town. It flew past Judith's body, which was already beginning to cover with dust, past the sign Kane and Sons, past the closed door of the sheriff's house, and fell by the old well, where many years ago a girl named Loretta was drowned, simply because she dared to give birth to a white man. And now history began to breathe again, and with each breath her moan sounded louder. Eli looked up silently. It was not anger in his eyes. It was not pleading. It was the look of a man who had seen too much pain to react to it as a normal man would. There was no rage in his eyes, no fear, only an unspeakable, silent awareness that death was not passing him by. He stood as if the world in which he had once been a man had long since collapsed, and now only dust remained. Judith lay on the ground. She was no longer moaning. Her breaths were quiet, rare, like those that come from a dead body. The air was thick with the smell of blood and earth and old iron. Each breath she took seemed to be a last effort, unknown to her, as if she were trying to breathe one last time into this dusty, sullen life that no longer had meaning. Eli did not move. He stood before her, as if saying goodbye to this piece of earth that had become his only friend in all these years of loneliness. He knew this horse would never get up. He knew her death was no accident. She was part of everything that was happening in this town. She was a target. Her life meant nothing to anyone who lived here, and that was obvious. Eli walked over to her and crouched down beside her, not touching her, but watching her every breath, every move. He looked up at the sun, which was already setting, turning the sky blood red. The wind was lifting dust from the ground, which still held traces of the bloodstain. Everything seemed sullen and lifeless. In that moment, he felt the weight of the silence that was filling the town, becoming almost tangible. The people in the stores, outside their windows, on their porches, stood and said nothing. They didn't look at him. They didn't look at the horse. They didn't look at what had happened. They just waited. They waited until the storm got too close. The silence was so thick you could cut it with a knife. A silence that covered the city like a giant blanket, not allowing a single soul to escape its clutches. All that hatred, hidden under the mask of good nature, was about to burst forth, and everyone in this city knew it. Eli stood up, turned around, and walked. He took his time. His steps sounded as if time had actually slowed down for him. He did not turn around, did not look in the direction of the dead horse. He simply walked away, leaving her there. He knew she would die, just as he knew this place had long since ceased to be his home. There was no going back for him. He was walking away not just from the dead horse. He was walking away from everything that had been. He was walking away not from what had happened to him, but from what had always happened to him and his kind. Bullets, fires, gallows. Eli was no stranger to them. But he was not a man to succumb to anger. Anger had no place in his soul. He walked like a man who already knew it all. There was a scent of the inevitable in the air. The people watched him, but they did not move. They all knew that he was more than just an old man with a horse. He was a symbol of what they had all tried to forget, a symbol of what had always been wrong, a symbol of what they feared but never acknowledged. His footsteps echoed in the streets, but they could not drown out the silence, a silence that grew thicker and more palpable with every step. At that moment, the old man appeared in Randall's store again, one of the few who knew what had passed between Eli and Randall. He was not one to judge the old black man, but he was not one to interfere either. He was a man who survived by keeping quiet. He watched Eli walk away down the dusty road and thought, "This won't end." And all his thoughts were like a curse that wouldn't go away. This won't end because we won't let it end. He just prayed that this wouldn't be anyone else's last day. When Eli turned the corner, everyone went back to their business as if nothing had happened. Randall was back at the store. He wasn't laughing anymore. He just stood there, watching Eli walk away. He knew it wouldn't end. He knew there was something so much more in that silence, something that wouldn't die with Eli and his horse. But Randall wasn't afraid. He felt the power pulsing through him, how he was the boss now, how he was the one who never lost. Eli left him there by the store with his cruel thoughts and a pride that was as empty as his own life. But in the silence, there was a threat that was about to explode, a threat that they had all once dismissed as a distant, invisible past, a threat they might not have noticed, but they could feel like a stench clogging their noses, a threat that followed Eli around. He hadn't gone to the front, he hadn't been a soldier, but he had outlived them. This wasn't the end, this was the beginning. The silence grew heavier and heavier with every step Eli took, and that heavy, hollow, oppressive air was what they all felt. And everyone knew there would be no forgiveness, there would be no forgetting, there would be no healing, because they wouldn't let it. In that moment it became clear that pride, like all of life, was just dust that could never be washed away. The sun was already setting behind the horizon, plunging the small town into that same thick shadow in which its secrets always hid. The evening sky was painted in orange-red hues, as if reminding one of the blood that had so often been spilled on these lands. The same old men as in the morning were standing at Randall's old store again, but now their conversations were not as light and carefree as always. There was something in the air today, and they knew it. Whispers were gradually spreading through the village. Rumors, as always, began to move along the streets, running like snakes through dusty cracks, between yards, and through open windows of houses. Even if someone did not want to hear, he was still forced to know. "Did you hear what happened to Eli?" The old man from the store threw out this question as if by chance, with the same expression on his face that is usually used when exchanging gossip about someone who has long been forgotten. "What happened?" asked his neighbor, without looking up from his stock. "Didn't you know? He's back again. After Randall hit him like that, he drove away, and no one's seen him since. No one even knew where he'd been. But he's definitely back now. He's back? Back. I don't know where exactly, but he's back. In the house? In the house, I guess. What happened to the horse? Was it dead? They're all silent, everyone. Some saw it. Some say he just left it in the street. Others say he burned it. Who's talking? Well, I heard that Eli burned all his land some time ago. They say he went back to where he was. That old house. Did you hear that? What the hell? He can't live there, the old man shouted, turning to his companion. He wiped his hands on his dirty pants and leaned toward his neighbor. I'll tell you what, all this stuff with his brother, with his land, it's just the end. That black man wouldn't be on this land if it weren't for the moment his brother died. 20 years ago, Randall said his place was under the white man's fingernails, a place where he could sell, kill if necessary, to keep the land clean. And his brother gave his life to buy land for Eli. But Eli was never part of this land. But they know it. Everyone here knows it. Where was he when it all happened? Why wasn't he there that day? You know? He could have gone there. He could have done it. But no. Everything is still the same. Silent. What are you, a bitch? Randall finished him off. Killed him. That's just the way it is. Do you think we have no one left? So what? Well, that was a long time ago. That was a long time ago. A long time ago. How long ago? Wait. Come back. You came back. See? Again? He's back, I'm telling you, Eli. This is not the place. Who the hell saved him? Him. With all that money. Get away from this fucking mission. It's all real. Let's take a short break. Write in the comments where you listen to our stories from, and whether there was anything similar in your life to what happens in these stories. We are interested to know your opinion. Subscribe so as not to miss the next parts. We continue. When Eli reappeared in the village, when he returned to this town after being gone for so long, the old men began to whisper. They did not whisper because he was the one who had always been a stranger, the one who, despite his silence, was still part of their fear. They whispered because he reminded them of a time when the whole town was on fire, when their hands were covered in blood, and when their own eyes could not look straight. He reminded them of a past they had run from so fast and so hard. Eli was different once, years ago, when he was young, when the world had not yet forgotten what it was to fear for your life. He was what they called the Black Devil. Those were the days when his name struck fear into white homes, when his footsteps carried the shadow of vengeance that seemed to haunt this city until the end of time. He was not just a black man then, he was the one who avenged his family, the one who was not afraid to give his life to bring some justice to a world overrun with racism and cruelty. He had lost everything, his wife, his children, his home, his world. All he had left was the strength that had once led him to become the one everyone feared. He was the avenger whose name had become a nightmare, whose words echoed in empty houses and abandoned fields. His hands were stained with blood, but they could not erase the shadow that remained on his heart. He had become part of those who dared to fight for what should have been his by right. But like everything in this world, his rebellion ended one day. He was gone, vanished, like all those who eventually fight this world for too long. He went deep into the swamps, to the river, where there was no one. He hid in those old dense forests, where the earth seemed heavy and old, where the trees seemed to remember all his steps. There, in the shadow of what had once been home, he lived through years of silence, years full of dark memories that would not let him go, would not let him forget. But now he was back in a city he hadn't set foot in for decades. His name was a whisper again, something people talked about in dark corners of shops and on abandoned street corners. He was back in the same city where everyone remembered what had once been, but no one wanted to remember it. Rumors began to spread through the streets, like water filling an old crack in the earth. Eli was back in town, and his horse was dead. He'd left it lying in the street, a mere trace of his life, and maybe that was really his farewell to this place, to this land, to this city. But there was something else. Eli wasn't just an old man with a horse, returning to the place of his past. He was the one who had once been a living symbol of rebellion, the one who had taken up arms against violence and offered no forgiveness, no apology. He was the one who could no longer be just a silent old man. And no matter how much he tried to hide his past, it was always with him, like a scar that could not be removed. The old men on the benches and the children playing by the road no longer laughed. People fell silent, hiding from his gaze, from the shadow that fell over this town with every step he took. When they remembered him, they did not think of old Eli, who lived silently with his horse. They thought of who he had been, of who he had become, of how his name had once inspired in them not only fear, but perhaps respect. And now this man had come again, and his return was like a curse that could not be undone. Some said he hadn't changed, that he was the same unbroken man who had once raised his hand to take back what was his. But others knew that too much time had passed, that what he had done in the past was now part of history, part of a nightmare that could not be escaped. His horse was dead, and with it was not only his past, but his future. A future that was now gone. This was the beginning of something new, something that was too heavy to simply let go. But the moment the rumors started to creep through the streets again, when they could no longer be ignored, when they grew louder, when they touched every corner of this city, everyone suddenly began to understand that nothing was for nothing. That Eli's return was not just an old man returning to his home, not just a man who had lost everything, but a man who had come again to give back what had once been taken from him. And now, as they thought about his past, as they whispered about him on the benches, they felt old wounds begin to bleed. Wounds they had tried to hide for so long. They remembered how they had once feared him, and now that Eli was here again, they were afraid again. And this fear was not only of him, but of what he symbolized. That world in which they thought everything was forgotten was actually alive, and this fear was what had finally come alive and returned, like an inevitable debt that they had to pay one day. The city waited. Eli said nothing, but his silence was so loud it sounded like a death sentence. There were no stars tonight. A low, sooty cloud hung over the sky, thick and still. The moon did not break through, as if it were hiding from what was to come. Hammerwood slept fitfully, though to all appearances, everything was as usual. Toby, the young deputy with a drink in his pocket and a dull look, dozing on the porch of the sheriff's station, the old lanterns creaking in the wind, the crickets chirping, not knowing that their sound was the very thing that held the foreboding tonight. But beneath the night, in the shadows that seemed deeper than usual, something was moving. No sound, no light, as if it were made of darkness itself. It knew the way. It knew the creaking of the boards under its feet in Randall's backyard. It knew where Randall kept his tools, knew where the rusty old barrel of gasoline was that he kept just in case, knew where the dogs slept and how to get around them without them barking. The night did not belong to Randall. The night belonged to someone who had been silent for too long, who had seen everything around him crumble under the weight of hypocrisy and filth and fear. Randall's house was big, with a wide porch, carved shutters, a Confederate flag faded in the sun but still fluttering proudly at the porch, an open wound of the past. He slept in a chair in the living room, fully dressed, his gun by his side, as always. He didn't believe anyone would dare come. He believed in fear, the fear that had kept this city on its knees for years. But fear has an expiration date. First, it was a smell, sharp, sweet, like an old gas station. He woke to something scraping at the door. Footsteps? Wind? He couldn't tell. He reached for his gun, but at that moment, a wave of smoke rolled through the crack under the door. And before he could open his mouth, a flash of fire lit up the hallway. Not an explosion, no. A bottle thrown right into the doorframe shattered, and flames licked the wood. It didn't shoot up into the air, didn't burst into flames, but it caught fire just enough to tell him it was no accident. It was a warning. The fire roared quietly but persistently. Randall jumped up, gun in hand, eyes full of panic. He screamed, but no one answered. He ran out into the street, barefoot, the toe of his coat charred, and saw the door of his house slowly, viciously consumed by fire. He screamed, called the dogs by name, but there was no sound. Not a sound, only the cracking of wood. He ran to the barn, suspecting everything, neighbors, tramps, teenagers. But when he opened the door, he staggered and fell to his knees. Inside, in the hay, lay his best cow, a pile of meat with her throat cut, a wide black wound from ear to ear. Her eyes were open, not glassy, alive, as if she had just died. On the wall above her, someone had written a word in charcoal. Not revenge, not justice, just one word, here. Not heard, not will hear, namely, here. Like a challenge, like a blow, like a curse. He recoiled. The gun fell from his hands. He screamed again, not from fear this time, but from helplessness, because he understood. This was not a robbery, not vandalism. These were not teenagers, not a psycho, not a stranger. This was someone who knew, someone who remembered, someone who did not forgive. The whole house did not burn down. In the morning, there were walls, charred boards, a black mark along the floor. The barn was still there, but the smell of blood and burnt wood and fear, stayed with him. Randall stayed inside the next day. He sat on the porch with his gun, his eyes bloodshot, his jaw clenched so hard his teeth gritted. The town began to talk, in whispers, the way it knew how. Who did this? Eli, I guess. Who else? Are you sure he'd do something like that? He's an old man. It's not the old man who came back. It's the shadow he brought with him. He's been more than a man for a long time. He's a reminder. Some said they saw a figure by the house before the fire. Some said they'd seen Eli by the old well that day. Some said it wasn't him at all, that there were many like him, that he was simply the first. But the truth was simple. No one doubted it. Eli didn't leave blood. He left fear. He didn't kill. He let them know. Do you hear? Do you understand what's coming next? His revenge wasn't quick. It was deliberate. And everyone who laughed when his horse died was silent now. Even the sheriff was silent, because everyone knew. This night was only the first. Midnight without stars was the starting point, and no one knew whose name would be next. Randall woke to a scream. It was a sharp, guttural sound that could not be the sound of human fear. It was a scream that came from something alive, but not quite human. He jumped out of bed, grabbed his gun and ran outside, where he was met by the same wind that was always in these parts, a constant reminder that everything here was as old as the earth itself. Dust rose into the air, filling his lungs, but Randall did not feel it. He felt nothing but emptiness in his chest. He ran to the barn, but it was empty. The fences were broken. The entire property was upended, as if a giant beast had passed through his fields. The ground, which had always been solid and contained, now looked like an upturned carpet. The 16-sided fence posts, which had once stood so firmly that they could not be knocked down even by a storm, now lay torn, like toys. He looked around, and his heart went cold. Someone, or something, had passed through his fields, as if they were desolate territory. Every step was like a blow, and it couldn't be an accident. His field, which had been his wealth, was now just a dirty mass. Randall walked further, and a premonition appeared in his eyes. He knew that not everything was just like that. He knew that perhaps now his life would never return to its former course. His gaze fell on the small yard with the chicken coop. His dogs were gone. The wind had torn branches from the trees, but there was no movement in the shadow of the fence. Randall grabbed the arm behind him, pulled around the corner, hoping that at least one of them was still there. But it's empty, no movement. "Where are you going, you damn creatures?" he roared, but his voice was not confident. He realized that his words had no power, and then he saw it. The walls of his barn, covered in thick moss, damp with morning dew, were coal black with something strange, something scratched. He came closer and barely contained his anger when he saw what was written. In charcoal, embedded in the white wood, was written clearly, "For the horse, for silence, for everything." Every word written on the wall sounded like a death sentence. Randall recoiled as if someone had slapped him in the face. He clenched his fists and realized with bitterness that this was not just a threat. This was an act of revenge. Revenge for the death of the horse. Revenge for the silence he had maintained. Revenge he could not avoid. "Bastard!" Randall muttered, but his voice was not firm, but rather weak. He knew that someone, or someone in his house, was the someone who was now playing this game. He realized that he could not hide from all this, and that the shadow he had previously accepted as forgotten was now standing before him again. He returned to the house. There was emptiness everywhere. His eyes were tired. There was silence in his ears. He walked through the house, through the land, but he did not feel it. This land had become alien to him, not his home, not his place. He realized that all this wealth of his, all these years, they now meant nothing. When he returned, he saw smoke on the horizon again, but it was not smoke from what had burned. It was smoke from what was still ahead. He looked around, and then he realized he was not just a prisoner of his fear, but a prisoner of his whole life. His wealth, his influence, all of it was nothing now. It was just a mask. There was nothing left now but the darkness that surrounded him from within and without. The city began to talk again, but not with respect. People whispered, hiding in the shadows of their houses. They were afraid, but they could not close their ears to everything that was happening around them. Fear spread like a plague through the streets. You could feel it in the air. All those loud words that burst from Randall's chest could not stop what was happening anymore. He was the one who stood at the center of this storm, but he was no longer its master. The silence seemed to wrap itself tighter around him, like a rope that tightened with every step. In the evening, when the city grew quiet and the lights began to dim, all he could hear was the ticking of his own heart, which sounded like a reminiscent bell. Randall understood that he could no longer turn back time, could not change what had happened. He was no longer the one who dictated the rules. He was the one everyone was waiting for, and every step, every look, was now directed at him with contempt, with accusation, with a premonition that the end was just around the corner. He knew he could not escape this storm. Inside him, deep in his soul, the sparks of what would become his destruction had long been smouldering. And in that moment, he stood alone, having lost everything he once thought was his, all his wealth, all his power, everything he thought he controlled, was now ashes. He was a man who had been silent for too long, who had remained in the shadows of his past for too long, and now he was paying for it. Randall began to feel his body begin to tremble. Everything that was happening seemed terrible to him, but he could not understand what would be more terrible. If his death came quickly, or if it came slowly, like something that comes only after you realize that you can no longer change anything. Let's take a short break. Write in the comments where you listened to our stories from, and whether there was anything similar to the events described in these stories in your life. We are always happy to hear your thoughts and opinions. Subscribe so as not to miss the next parts. We continue. Randall's house, the town began to change. It wasn't sudden, no. Everything flowed as usual, but something in the air was different. People stopped going out after dark. Women quickly closed their shutters. Men sat on their porches with guns in their hands, and children, even the most daring, no longer ran through the alleys. Whispers began to spread through the town again. Not the same as before. Not gossip. Not talk of a black horse. Not of a silent old man. Not of the one who threw a bottle of fire. This was a different whisper. Unsubstantiated. Knowing, as if someone had finally remembered what they were so afraid of. It began with one boy running along the road outside of town and was the first to see a black car. Old, long, without license plates. Dusty, as if it was driving on a land where there were no more maps. 3 people got out, all in black trench coats, tall and strong, with faces that seemed carved out of anger. They didn't laugh, didn't look back. They just stood there, and the town knew they weren't guests. The next day, a second car showed up, then a third. 7 men, then 9. And then no one knew how many there were. They didn't stay in hotels. They didn't go into bars. They didn't eat in diners or shop in stores. They just showed up, at the end of the street, on the side of the road, at a rickety church, on a farm, outside a store. They didn't speak. They looked, and no one asked who they were, because everyone knew. He'd called them. Eli wasn't alone. It was like a death sentence. They whispered the words in bread lines, at gas stations, in locked kitchens, whispered with terror, with trembling voices. Because these weren't just friends. These weren't just allies. These were the ones who had come for more than just revenge. They had come to repay a debt. The ones who had once fought with clubs against the police. The ones who had disappeared into the Louisiana swamps to avoid white hands. The ones who had been forgotten, erased, but not broken. They were called by many names. Some said they were the old army that had gone underground. Others said they were the ones Eli had once saved. Some even whispered, "These aren't people. They're shadows of his past. They're the dead." The whites in town began to panic. The first to leave was the old butcher, who packed up his family and left at night without even closing up shop. Then came the deputy sheriff. Then came one of the farmers whose nephew had once helped set fire to Eli's brother's house. Those who remained began to gather for prayer. The pastor opened the church every night and read the Psalms out loud with a trembling voice, but no one listened. Because it seemed like God had left. The people stopped lingering in Randall's store. No one spoke to him openly anymore. He sat in a chair on the porch, a gun in his lap, a bottle in his hand, and his face like the face of an old wolf with nowhere left to run. He heard footsteps in the night. He saw shapes standing at his boundary. He knew they were playing with him. They weren't killing him because that would be a mercy. They wanted him to rot from the inside, like his laugh had rotted. And then one afternoon, when the town seemed to hold its breath, one of them walked up to the sheriff, right in front of everyone. He wore a black trench coat. His head was shaved, his eyes like people who had seen death off the screen. He didn't say hello. He didn't shake hands. All he said was, "You're not coming between us." And the sheriff, the man who acted like the law, didn't answer. He just stepped back. And the whole town knew. There was no law anymore. There was only justice, and the one who would arrange it. Eli showed up that same evening. He walked down the main street with the same posture, the same gait. Only now there were 3 people walking behind him, one with a cross tattooed on his face, the second with burnt fingers, the third with empty eyes. People retreated, hid, drew the curtains. Eli walked in silence. He didn't look at anyone, only at the sign by the gate on which was burned, "Hammerwood, glory to labor, glory to the land, glory to our fathers." And he stopped, looked, for a long time, a very long time, and then he spat right on the ground in front of her and moved on, and everyone who saw it knew they wouldn't wait long. Evening fell over the city like a shroud, and no one knew what the morning would bring. Only one thing was clear to everyone. He was no longer alone. And now this city will not forget what it means to hear the shadows of the past. The morning began with silence. Not the peaceful silence of birds singing in the sunrise, the silence that hangs over a cemetery before a storm. Not a dog barked, not a motor started. Not a single shop opened its shutters. People looked out the windows, dressed but not out. They knew it was today, that it was the end that had been brewing in the earth for years. And if anyone had hoped that it was still possible to let it slide, that the fear would dissipate like dreams at dawn, today they realized, no, there would be no oblivion today. At 7 in the morning, silhouettes appeared on the main square, black cloaks, broad shoulders, silent, without words. They walked like executioners from the ancient world, unhurried but precise. Behind them was Eli, in a black shirt, in the same old hat. His face was stony. No anger, no joy, only concentration. There was a saddle lying in the cart nearby, Judith's saddle, blackened with age, torn but carefully frayed. There was still blood on it, her blood. The blood of a horse that had been killed not out of need, but out of contempt. The saddle was placed in the center of the square. People began to emerge from their houses, some with babies in their arms, some in dressing gowns, some in jeans with keys slung around their waists. Everyone walked silently, standing at the edges, not coming closer. It felt as if the air itself had become heavier. It pressed, muffled, died away. 8 people approached Randall's house. They did not break down the door. They did not shout. They simply walked in. Half a minute later, he was led out. He resisted. He spat. He screamed, "I am not guilty of anything. Are you crazy? This is a damn horse, a black nag." But no one listened to him. They led him out barefoot, wearing only his pants. His hair was disheveled, his face white as chalk. He twitched like a cornered animal. As they pushed him closer to the center of the square, he saw the saddle, and he went quiet, as if everything finally clicked in his head. He looked at Eli. "Are you serious? You want me to, in front of this? It's just a saddle. It's a goddamn dead horsehide. Are you out of your mind, you old bastard?" But no one answered. They lowered him to his knees, facing the saddle. One of the men who had arrived stood on a wooden stool nearby. He was holding an old revolver. No unnecessary pathos. Simple, like the whole trial. Eli came closer. His footsteps echoed. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at Randall. Slowly, without malice, like looking at something that has long been dead, but is still twitching. He said, "Apologize." Randall chuckled. He spat to the side. "No way. I'd do it again. That animal wasn't worth a bullet. And you too, all of you. You're dust, dirt underfoot. You've been silent for years. You've hidden in the swamps. You've worked for us, and you will work for us. I'm not afraid of you. Do you think you're a judge? You're nobody. I was born here. This is my land, my city." He screamed like a drowning man, clinging to the last drops of his illusion of power. But the air didn't shake from his screams. No one responded. No one intervened. Not one of those who had bought tobacco from him all their lives took a step forward. Eli didn't move. He just stood there. And that silence was more terrible than a shot. One of the men in the cloak raised his gun and slammed the butt of it into Randall's shoulder. He fell. Trying to rise, he looked into the eyes of the crowd. "Someone tell me! I knew you all. I helped you. Where are you, bitches?" But no one said anything. He knelt down, slowly. His eyes darted around. Then they settled on the saddle. Is this because of that thing? You want me to apologize to a fucking saddle? This is the saddle of a black scum. It's not even alive!" He fell silent. There was no longer anger in his voice. There was something else, a breakdown, panic. "Please." He didn't say this to Eli. He said it to the void. But the void didn't answer. The man with the revolver came closer, slowly. And then Randall, hunched over, dirt on his knees, his hands shaking, squeezed out. Okay, fine. I apologize. For this. For the horse. For silence. That's it. Okay? Are you satisfied, old man? Is that it? He waited for someone to nod, to say yes, to say that's it. But there was no answer. Just a shot. One. Clear. To the temple. Randall's head jerked to the side. His body went limp and fell onto the saddle. Blood trickled down his skin. The crowd stood silent. No one screamed. No one turned around. No one covered the children's eyes. It wasn't just a shot. It was a seal. The end. A silent spectacle in which no one applauded. The people began to disperse, slowly, without words. All that was left in the square was a body, a saddle, and silence. Eli watched the blood. It slowly soaked into the ground. The very ground Randall called his own. And now it accepted him, the way he had accepted strangers all his life, coldly and without mercy. Eli didn't smile. He didn't sigh. He simply walked away. And the shadow that fell from his figure was longer than that of any other man in this city. The trial without a courtroom was over. And now all of Hammerwood knew, for some sins, there is no forgiveness. There is only silence and a bullet. Let's take a short break. Write in the comments where you listen to our stories from and whether there was anything similar in your life to what happens in these stories. We are interested to know your opinion. Subscribe so as not to miss the continuation. We continue. When dawn came, the whole town already knew that Randall would not return home. The light smoke that had not yet cleared in the air was the last evidence that there had once been life here, that there had once been a house that belonged to him. In the empty sky, covered with grey clouds, barely noticeable black footprints went into dark, deep spaces. The blood had not yet dried on the ground, and ash was already beginning to cover it, like an old wound that no one wanted to heal. The next morning, when the city woke up, everything was going according to plan. But there was something different in the air. Silence. A suspicious, heavy silence. People were waking up, getting dressed, going to the shops. But everyone who walked the streets knew that this day would not be like all the others. They did not say it out loud, but everyone understood. In the morning, a crowd had already gathered in the square. The sheriff stood in the corner, silently watching. He did not know what to do. He could not even imagine how to react to this now. When his eyes met those standing next to him, people who also lived in this city, there was no fear in their gaze. There was only a shadow, an emptiness that had not been in this city before. Eli didn't come to the square. He was out there, where there were no more eyes. His men didn't show up either. They disappeared as silently as they had come. It all happened so fast. The whole town didn't even have time to comprehend what had happened. They only saw how the next day, where Randall's house had been, there was nothing left but a pile of burnt boards, charred bricks, and an empty space. The ground was now as black as the sky the day Randall had burned Eli's land. People seemed to have forgotten that there had been a day when Randall could look at everyone and say that his land was his. But now, as he lay there, on the very land he had once called his own, his tracks were gone, as all traces of him vanish when they stray too far from their roots. All those who had shared in his madness, who had stood by, were silent. They did not move. They did not speak. Because this land was someone else's now. No one argued. It was clear. Everyone knew it was gone. All that was left was the land, and it was no longer his. That evening, people began signing papers, acknowledging that the land where Randall's house had once stood was no longer his. Title deeds were signed. No talking, no long discussions. It was that simple. Some of them, these people who years ago had worn hats in front of him and held his hand over his shoulder, now stood next to others, to those who had once been lower. They stood side by side, without shame or joy. There was no relief in their faces, just cold. Those who had kept silent for years, who had run from what had happened, now found themselves in the very place where there was no longer any truth or guilt. They signed the papers and left the place without looking back. This was not a victory. This was not a moment of triumph. This was a moment of death that none of them could escape. Randall's horse, that last grim symbol of his pride and strength, was nothing more than ashes. Everything he had once considered his was now swallowed up by the earth. Even its traces were gone. There was no Randall in this place anymore, only an empty field. That afternoon, a new batch of earth was brought into town. No sign, no name, but no one was happy. Any life that might have been there was consumed by fire and forgotten. No Randall, no name, now part of that same dark past. And with every step, with every hammer blow, with every sheet that was signed, this town died a little more. The land that had once been so alive was now empty, silent. All its legends, all its traditions, all its stories were now taken away, and all that was left was the field. But something remained within these walls. The crisis that had befallen Hammerwood was only the beginning. Now the city didn't know how to go back, how to return to the old world, when no one could remember how things had been before. People returned home, but their steps became quiet, as if they didn't want to wake something alive, something that still lurked in the shadows, in the shadow of Eli, in the shadow of what he had brought with him. As the sun began to set and the last shadow stretched across this dead field, black figures appeared on the horizon again. Without words, without a cry, those who were still alive closed the windows and doors. They knew that with every step they took, with every glance, this shadow would grow, and so it remains. The earth is covered in ash, but has not forgotten those who once were on it. Eli rode down that dusty road again. without a horse, without a saddle, without what had once defined his life. All he had left was an old, tattered pack on his shoulders and an old, threadbare coat that had long since lost its original brightness of colour. There was a cynical cycle of fate in it, when all of life, with its promises and sacrifices, is reduced to emptiness. He was not going back to the house that burned. He was not going back to those who were silent or who screamed. He was not going back to Randall. He was simply going back to that road. The dust was the same. The wind was the same. This city was the same, but it was no longer his. With every step, with every breath, Eli felt it. This city was just a graveyard for what was lost, for what had become dust. There were no enemies, no friends, no brothers. There was only silence, only those who had left, and those who remained. Those who could never understand what had happened, and those who would never believe what had happened. When Eli walked down the dusty road, his steps were not solemn. He did not walk with the dignity of a winner. He walked like a man who had just survived a war, but despite that, had not found peace. He did not walk to be noticed, not to be talked about. He walked because there was no other way, and that way led him back to where he had come from, but no longer in the same state as before. He walked down the road like a zombie, like a man who had already lost everything, but still could not die. There was no fire in his eyes, no pain, only weariness that had been gathering for years, like rain that falls slowly to the ground, without strength or purpose. But there was a shadow in his eyes too, the shadow of the vengeance, the justice he had sought and received, but which had brought him no satisfaction or peace. He had killed Randall. He had destroyed him, as he had burned Eli's land. He had avenged his horse, his family, his past, but it had not set him free. He doesn't smile. He doesn't laugh. He just walks. And this path that seemed long and hopeless to him has now become a part of him. He was the one who lived through it all, the one who learned to be silent, the one who saw how shadows were born from fire. He was no longer a man with a name, with a face, with a story. He was just a shadow wandering through this dead world. People passed by, and those who remained passed by. He knew they saw him, but they did not dare look him in the eye. They looked at the ground, at nothing. They looked at him as if he were a ghost, as if he were a reminder of what they feared. Eli did not notice them. He did not feel any hatred. He felt nothing, because he was already in another world. A world with no room for regrets. A world with no future. There were no clouds in the air, the same lifeless grey sky that hung over this land. Hopelessness. That was what was in that sky. Hopelessness that consumed everything that had once been alive. Everything that had once mattered. It was dead now. It was all destroyed. And Eli knew it could never be brought back. He passed old houses, the same doors behind which there had once been joys and pains in his life. He saw these houses, but he didn't feel them. They were empty, like everything else. Empty, like his memories. He knew that he would never return, even if he wanted to. He knew that this city would never be what it was. It had become something else. Something dead, like himself. Silently, he walked on. This time, the road did not lead him home, did not lead to those who remained. It led him only into emptiness. And in this emptiness, there was only one thing. The load he was carrying was so heavy that he could not throw it off. But Eli walked, because there was no other way, and there was no rage or joy or desire in his chest. There was only one thing, the feeling that he was the one who had lived through it all, but still could not leave, step by step, into the void, to the place that had become his new home, to the world he no longer tried to understand. He walked because this path was already a part of him, and he knew that it would not end, because there was no end to this world. There was only what remained and what was gone. In this empty world, where there were no enemies, no friends, no one who could tell him anything, Eli could find neither peace nor revenge. He only walked, feeling the weight of old memories under his nails. He walked like a man who had lost everything, but was not yet dead. And perhaps that was the most terrible thing. He knew that everything that had happened before did not matter. And despite this, he could not stop. There were no clouds in the sky. Eli kept walking, and that was all he could do. We would love to know what you think about this story. Have you had any experiences with racism in your life? Your thoughts and opinions are very important to us, and we value each and every one of you. Share your opinion in the comments. It means a lot to us. Don't forget to like it if you enjoyed it, and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Have a nice day, and if you listen to the end, write in the comments the phrase, "I'm with you until the end." This way we'll know for sure that you're with us.